doing a batch tomorrow that kind of ticks off a couple boxes. One, we're using a new malt. Got some Murphy and Rood based, some pale malt and some crystal malt that we're going to use. So that'll be interesting to use. And two, doing a 5-gallon batch, and then I'm going to split it into 2 fermenters. I've really been I'm wanting to get a little bit more involved with doing some dry yeast. I guess I want to get a little bit more experience using dry yeast. I use a lot of liquid yeast over the years, and I've been doing harvesting yeast, repitching yeast, and it's generally worked out well. Liquid yeast, you really need to make sure you're purchasing it pretty fresh. If it sits around for 4+ months, you're not quite sure what you're going to get when you open the pack. Harvesting yeast, again, if you use it within, say, a month, I have really good luck. Once I get past there, then I'm starting to wonder, how viable is that yeast? How much yeast do I need to put into a starter? How big of a starter do I need to make? The great thing about dry yeast, it's inexpensive. It stores well, so I could just order a bunch of them at the beginning of the year from either mail order or just pick them up when I'm at my local brew shop. Don't necessarily have to plan them right around brew days. And then it's a little easier to for consistency and amount. There's some beers, some like a Quebec or some of the Belgian beers where pitch rate really starts to impact the flavor profile. And I find having a little bit of inconsistency, getting the right flavor profile I want in some of my Belgian beers. So I think maybe dry yeast will help out in that area as well. So this batch, we're going to split it in 2. I'm going to try half of it in S-33, which from my understanding is a pretty decent, just standard English ESB type yeast, which might give it some good flavor. And then just kind of general control, I'm going to do a Chico one. I'll probably use, I guess I'll either split this US-05 pack in half, or I'll do this Cellar Science Cali Ale yeast. I'll figure out which one I want to do. Probably just pitch a half a pack of each of these into the 2.5-gallon batch, just because that'll sort of simulate what I would get for pitching a whole pack into a 5-gallon batch. So I've already got my grain milled up. I did that because tonight my son will be sleeping in the room over there. Didn't want to make a bunch of noise and wake him up in the morning milling grain.
For this batch, I measure out 10 pounds, or about 4.5 kilograms, of Murphy and Rood pale malt, and also 1/3 of a pound, or about 340 grams, of Murphy and Rood Crystal 40. So my barley crusher's seen better days. It was struggling with the extra plump kernels of the Murphy and Rood pale malt, so I ended up crushing the grain once at a wider gap, then running it back through at my standard gap setting. And that strategy ended up working out pretty well. Now that's exactly what I like to see. A nice fine crush works well for brewing the bag as far as boosting efficiency. Based on the amount of grain and the 30-minute boil, I calculate that I need 7.25 gallons or 27.4 liters of strike water. Once I have the water measured out, I mix in my acid and gypsum additions as the water is heating up. I slowly add the grain to the brew kettle, stirring well as I go. Even then, I found a few dough balls that I needed to take care of. I verify that I'm on track with my target mash temperature. Then I start my 60-minute mash timer. I wrap up my kettle in the sleeping bag during the mash. I find that even on a cool day, I lose at max 2 degrees Fahrenheit over a 60-minute mash. So here, around the 30-minute mark, I'll unzip the sleeping bag to give it a stir, and also take a sample for a pH reading. With the sleeping bag doubled over itself, I'm able to use the zipper to get access without having to remove the entire sleeping bag. I'm pretty happy how this works. With no dry hop additions, this batch gets a pretty decent shot of hops in the boil. just a little bit of Columbus to add about 18 IBUs, then a total of 4 ounces or 113 grams of Amarillo hops, with additions being made at 10 minutes, flame out, and then also a whirlpool addition. As the wort approaches boiling, it's about time to add the Columbus, 0.4 ounces or 11 grams. Remember, this batch just gets a 30-minute boil. Then I add 1 ounce or 28 grams of Amarillo at the 10-minute mark, along with a Whirlfloc tablet. Another 1 ounce of Amarillo goes in at flame out before killing the heat. I added my immersion chiller, which has been sitting in my bucket of Star Sand to sanitize. I'll run the chiller while stirring the wort to drop the temperature down to about 170 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius. It only takes a few minutes to drop the temperature. Then I am ready to add in my whirlpool, or maybe better called the hop steep edition. I add the 2 ounces or 56 grams of Amarillo hop and give them a good stir. I will come back every 5 minutes to give the hops another good stir. Between stirs, I cover up the pot as well as I can. I use the hop steep time to get a jump start on my cleaning, and also to sanitize my fermentation equipment. After the 20-minute hop steep is done, I chill down the wort. Oh, can I do it? Can I do it? Can I do it? Yes, oh, maybe not quite. Yeah, pouring the wort like this works well for my 2.5 gallon batches, but not so well for my 5 gallon batches. Watching videos like this of my process is kind of motivating me to get a kettle with a ball valve. Maybe I could throw in a pump and a whirlpool port to eliminate all the manual stirring as well. That would be great. The strainer also works a little better for only a little bit of hops. Since this is a split investigated batch, I try to get about the same volume and amount of trub into each fermenter. The fermenters are filled with just a little bit of mess to hose down. I move both of the fermenters into my chamber to cool down the last little bit to pitching temperatures. The beers have been in the chamber for about 3.5 hours now. They've settled down at about 64 degrees. I'm going to go ahead and pitch. I went ahead and hydrated some yeast. I don't always hydrate it, but I feel like in a little sanitized container with some water is a good way to measure out a half a pack. So these are both half a pack of US-05 and half a pack of S-33. Smells nice and yeasty. This is, make sure we got the right one, US-05 into the US-05 batch. S-33 into the S-33 batch. The following morning I checked in on the beers. The S-33 batch had started faster and is already at near full fermentation mode. The US-05 batch had just started to develop a krausen, but it's picking up. At about 24 hours, both batches have a very active krausen and fermentation. The S-33 batch started to slow fermentation after about 3 days. The US-05 batch chugged along for about a week. As fermentation slowed, I raised the temperature in the chamber to drive full fermentation. After about 2 weeks, I transferred the beers into purged kegs. After about 2 weeks in the keg, I sat down for a tasting. Warning, the video went a little longer than I planned, but I do try to cover some good topics.
So it's time for the reward. I get to drink some beers. So I have a couple beers in front of me, and I've also got a notepad so I can try to make this run through this quickly. I don't think you want to spend too much time watching me stick my nose down in the beers. These glasses, I poured these a few minutes ago. I was trying to get the camera angle set up, but hopefully we can kind of see as they progress. So what I want to cover today, one, just talk about learning new things with brewing. I've been brewing for a while, but I'm still looking for ways to learn. Do a quick rundown of the recipe, what we're drinking here. Just general thoughts on yeast comparisons, experimental beers. And then I'm gonna compare these two beers, which is a US-05 versus an S-33 beer. Like I said, so I've been brewing a long time. I always like to try out new things. So these ones have several kind of new things, or just things in general I'm working on. One, the malt bill. It's all malts from Murphy and Root, a custom craft maltster located in Charlottesville, Virginia. So that's kind of interesting. I want to just revisit Amarillo hops. Amarillo hops I used to use a lot. I kind of haven't used that much lately. Split yeast, as we'll talk about, which is one of the core drivers. US-05 versus S-33. Learning about dry yeast. I started off brewing using kind of poor quality dry yeast. I kind of gravitated toward liquid yeast because they were better. These days there's a lot of good quality dry yeast, and there's a lot of varieties out there, so I really would like to play around with more dry yeast. So S-33 is a yeast that I've never used before. US-05, I tend to use the liquid versions of the Chico strain. Whirlpool versus dry hops. I guess years ago I moved to dry hop and pale ales. Recently tried one with a Whirlpool instead of a dry hop. I liked it, so I did the same thing here. So we'll talk a little bit about the quality of that. Refractometer. I won't cover too much, but I tried to use my refractometer for the first time, really measuring or monitoring in fermentation. I got the end and realized my refractometer with distilled water was reading off about 2 Plato, so that was kind of a fail. So I need to cycle back. I kind of done some stuff to try to recalibrate my refractometer so I could use that for monitoring during active fermentation. Potentially, just taking final gravity readings or taking in fermentation readings instead of having to take a good full 6-ounce sample. 30-minute boils. I've started moving hoppy beers, pale ales, IPAs to just a 30-minute boil with a 30-minute addition. These are the same. It's been working out well for me. It's worked out well in this beers too. So quick rundown of the recipe. So this is, again, Murphy and Root malt, 97% of their American two-row pale malt, 7% of a Crystal 40, I believe it was. Their pale malt was a really plump malt. It is definitely visibly larger kernels than some of my other malts. I had a hard time getting it through my barley crusher, which is getting a little old. So I ended up having to double crush it. So I widened the gap, run it through, then set it back to my normal mill setting, run it through. So I ended up overshooting my gravity. I was shooting for a 1052 beer. I got a 1058 beer, which kind of pushed these up a little bigger than what I like for a pale ale. And I have to think it's either just the malts or the double crushing that drove my efficiency up. So that's something else for me to think about in the future. I mean, maybe double crushing my malts would be a good strategy just for getting some free gravity points. The recipe was just it was 0.4 ounces of Columbus for 18 IBUs. It was an ounce of Amarillo at a 10-minute edition, an ounce of Amarillo at a Whirlpool edition, or at a Flame Out edition. And again, this is a 5-gallon batch. And then it was I cooled it down to about 170. Added 2 ounces of Amarillo, and I believe I stirred that intermittently for 20 minutes. I think it dropped to probably about 190. from 170 down to about probably 160. Again, split with US-05, S-33, half in a 2.5 gallon sort of, or about 2.6 gallons into each fermenter. I have some 3-gallon fermenters. Used a half packet of yeast for each, just to mimic what I would put, full pack in a 5-gallon batch. Adjusted the water, to just my simple stuff. I boosted sulfate up with gypsum to about 200. I used some phosphoric acid to lower the pH to about 5.4 is my target. Target 153 Fahrenheit mash temperature. Actually started 1 degree above that, fell at 154, fell to 152 by the end. I think about 152 is probably a pretty good generic mash temperature. Fermentation, I use my pretty standard, what I would use for an IPA or pale ale. Started fermentation pitched the yeast at 65 Fahrenheit. After a few days, as fermentation started to slow, I boosted it up a couple degrees here and there, got it up to 72 and left it. And then I did a closed can transfer into 2.5 gallon torpedo keg on day 13. So the beer, where are we now? It's been in the keg for probably, I think, about 2 weeks now. So general thoughts on yeast comparisons. So I really love, I think this is one of the easiest comparisons you can do, just because there's very little impact on your brew day. You just brew a batch of beer. All you need is potentially 2 small fermenters, and then you just, it works really well. 2.5 gallons is a great size for just a standard direct pitch of a White Labs Y yeast pack. Dry yeast makes it pretty easy as far as splitting packs, or you could just throw in a whole pack in. It's very informative too. I think it's the easiest way to get side-by-side tasting of beers. I think side-by-side is really, it's much easier to evaluate subtle differences when you're tasting side-by-side than you're trying to think back in your memory from months ago. There are flaws though, I would say. One, the recipe may not be tuned to the yeast. If the attenuation of the yeast is different, some of the flavors of the yeast are different, you may want to think about tuning a recipe for the yeast. In this case, this is probably Chico, the California yeast is what I've used mostly for my pale ales. I kind of that's what I've built pale ale recipes around. So this is really a recipe that's built for a Chico strain. So you would kind of expect maybe Chico to excel a little bit in this recipe. Same fermentation temperatures may not fit both yeasts. In this case, I think they worked out pretty well, but I've not used S-33 before. Maybe it produces better flavors at a cool temperature. Maybe warmer temperatures. Maybe I boosted the temperature too fast. Again, you really need to get some experience with the yeast. So one batch only really tells a partial story. But again, I think it's a very informative way to try out new yeasts and evaluate flavors. So let's go ahead and we talk specifically. So I've got the 2 beers. I've labeled them. I've tasted them. This is the US-05. This is the S-33. The S-33 packs, it started faster. It was showing fermentation signs that night before I went to bed. They both were fermenting, at a pretty good pace by the following morning. The S-33 seemed to ferment a little more vigorously and finish up quicker. The US-05, seemed very similar to what I generally expect from Chico strains. It was fermenting well the next day. It consistently fermented, good 5 days. I think around day 7, both beers were at final gravity and just needed time to clear up. So they were in the fermenter for 13 days before they kegged. As far as the final gravity and attenuation, there are definitely some differences there. US-05. So again, these beers started 10:58, both of them, same wort. US-05 finished at a fairly standard 10:12. So with that extra gravity, I ended up with a 6.1% beer. 78% attenuation, which I think is pretty on kind of expected what I would get with a Chico strain. Again, the S-33 has got a reputation. This is sort of a low attenuating ESB yeast. Finished at 1018, which is higher than, it's a fairly high, but I think it's expected. So 5.3% ABV, 68% attenuation, which again I think is on par with what you expect from that yeast. When we look at the beers, I don't know if we can see the US-05 one is definitely has cleared up faster. It's more of a, this actually looks pretty good. I think it wouldn't be as clear as a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale if you had them next to each other, but it's pretty close. S-33 definitely has got a just kind of a powdery haze to it. Not a New England IPA haze, just a little bit, probably some clarity, which may clear up if it in the keg for a little bit longer. Aroma. These beers, of yeast trials I've done, these are two of the more different ones. I mean, I really get the hops show through. I'm not getting really. I've used the Chico strain so much that if I don't know if it sort of, to me it smells and tastes like beer. I really get it showcases the hops. Hop aroma is what I get. And this is where you definitely get a significantly different aroma difference. Originally I wasn't quite sure how to describe what I was getting on the S-33. I saw somebody describe it as apricot, and I think that is probably the sort of dried apricot-y kind of aroma is what it adds, is what I get. Flavor is very, I'd have very similar comments on the flavor. This is a big pale ale, 1058, and so it's hard to tell what qualities come from the Murphy and Rood malts versus say using a raw or Breeze or different maltsters. But the US-05 one, this tastes like what I expect in an American pale ale. It's got a clean body. It really lets the hop aromas and flavors. It's got a malty backbone. This one, these foams feel a little heavy, and I think some of that's just the high gravity, and a 6.1% pale ale is kind of bigger than what I typically shoot for. But it's a really nice tasting beer. The S-33, it's again, I got that. It's sweeter. I think when I've found drinking a full pint of this, I think it's more than just my biases, that the idea that knowing that it's both a high gravity, high original gravity and high final gravity, that I would expect it to be sweet and full. I think it actually is a little bit sweet and full. So I think that a bit of the sweetness combined with the apricot-y kind of fruity characters that I get, I think it just makes it a little bit kind of thick, I guess maybe would be the word, a little bit. So I think that would be my overall, kind of feeling. Like this kind of fits what I'm looking for in a pale ale. And this one kind of it's a little bit thick and sweet, and the apricot flavor I don't know that it sort of fits in this, but I think when we look back at when I'm talking about yeast, that this is a recipe with crystal malt in it. It's got a 153 mash temperature. So if I was tuning it for S-33, maybe if I swap the crystal, maybe for some Munich, maybe if I lowered the mash temperature to help with the attenuation a little bit. So maybe I could tune this recipe better to fit S-33. So again, I'm going to cycle back to sometimes just one beer doesn't necessarily tell the full story for a yeast. But then as far as the overall recipe, I think it's a really solid. There's nothing special about this recipe. It's very similar to pale ales that I've brewed over the years, and I really think to get that about 6, 7, 8% of a crystal 40 really adds a nice amount of color and flavor, especially for that US-05. As I mentioned, maybe swapping out the crystal for S-33 if that's what you're shooting for. The Murphy and Root malts, again, it's hard for me to pick them out. There's nothing that jumps out at me as extremely bad. There's also nothing jumps out at me as wow that really sticks out is good. So I think they're just good quality malts from a local craft maltster, so that's pretty cool. Amarillo hops. I used to, when the Amarillo hops were new, I thought they were the greatest thing. I think these days there's just so many good fruity hops. I think they tend to me, maybe gravitate toward a little bit of citrusy, pithy kind of flavors. They definitely have the orange character. One thing I would say is, the last Amarillo I've used, I bought 2 8-ounce packets from the same vendor, and those have been my exposure to Amarillo the last couple of years. So it could just be that particular crop year, that particular vendor, that particular package that I got. I don't get. Some people say diesel-y. I don't know if I get something diesel-y. I'm not sure how I would describe that in a beer. But as a single Amarillo and a single hop, I'm kind of or a single hop beer. Yeah, I think there's hops that I just like better than Amarillo these days. But I'll probably continue to play with Amarillo. We talked about the yeast. Dry yeast, like I said, is I don't get anything in here that would be a flaw from the dry US-05 versus P001 or the 1056 from Yeast. But it'd be interesting to do a side-by-side just to see the S-33. They were definitely very easy to use and just opened up half a pack. I think I hydrated half a pack and dumped them in. Whirlpool versus dry hop. So I think it's a flip for me. I think that I like the hop character of these. I can definitely see where I know Sierra Nevada Pale Ale is not dry hopped, but Sierra Nevada has a long, probably cooling whirlpool process, and I can definitely tell where the hop character in these beers is very similar to what I would expect from Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. And there's hop aroma, there's hop flavor. 4 ounces of hops in a 5-gallon batch. All of that on the hop side, nothing in the dry hop. So the benefit of not dry hopping is you don't have to worry about opening up your fermenter and potentially introducing oxygen. You have less. Depending on how much hop matter transfers over from the boil, you're going to end up with less hop matter in your fermenter. Hop matter from the boil will probably settle out earlier along with the yeast, whereas dry hops sometimes are a little bit of a pain to drop out. I've been usually, when I do dry hop beers, I like to cold crash them, which means some little extra protection for suck back, which I wouldn't have to do here. I don't think I cold crash these beers. So I think it's a flip. The Whirlpool adds, for me, it's a manual process. I come back every 5 minutes and stir for 20 minutes. Usually I can get some cleaning done during that time. But it does add a little bit of time to the brew day and a little bit of complexity to the brew day. Whereas dry hopping is a pretty simple process. It just has a couple little gotchas along with it. Refractometer, I've got that calibrated. In the 30-minute boils, I don't see any flaws in here that are this if it's clarity. I mean this is as clear as I expect my homebrewed pale ales to be. I don't see any flaws related to if they're not doing a 90-minute boil. I think the bitterness on these is good. It's about where I want it. And that kind of dials back a little bit. I've noticed that the couple batches I did with the Whirlpool editions. It does up the bitterness, as you would expect when you add, say, 2 ounces into a Whirlpool versus instead of putting 2 ounces into a dry hop. It does up the bitterness in it. So I do need to make sure I keep an eye on if I'm rebrewing recipes that had dry hop and I'm swapping over to a Whirlpool, that I keep an eye on the bitterness. I think these ones they're where I like them for a pale ale. But also maybe that it's a pretty high original gravity. So if the original gravity was 1052, it might be that these are a little bit off balance. But all right, I've kind of gone on, I think, as long as I want. Again, I'm really happy with this recipe. I'm really happy with how this turned out. I think I learned a bit from these split batches. I'm definitely interested in trying. I guess I don't know how much I'm interested in trying S-33 and something like a New England IPA, just because I've got packs of the Verdant yeast, which is pretty interesting. So I think that's somewhere on my timeline would be hoppy beer, hazy, whether it's a full blown New England IPA or just a hazy pale ale. S-33 compared to the Verdant, the low attenuation. One thing I've struggled with the last time I tried to brew a hazy pale ale was just trying to get some of that mouthfeel into it. With a low starting original gravity, it's hard to compete with 7% New England IPA that may start at 1065, 1070 when you're starting at 1050. So the S-33 attenuation may help there. So that would be an interesting, again. So it may be that the S-33 is just a better fit for that style beer instead of a pale ale. But I think I've covered what I want to do. I would definitely, if you're interested in brewing this recipe, brew it. It's very standard pale ale recipe. If you're interested in trying this split yeast, I definitely advocate brewing more, whether you're brewing a 10-gallon batch and splitting it into 5-gallon fermenters, or you're doing what I did here, which is brew a 5-gallon batch and split it into 2.5 gallons into each fermenter. It's a great way to get 2 different beers. It's a great way to learn about something new. It's a great way to make good beers and learn and keep moving forward. But thanks a lot for following along. Hopefully you can take some of what you've learned and get out there and build some better beer.